Everyone, thank you again today for joining us. We appreciate having you as we talk a bit about our redemption campaign here at the ACLU of Colorado. So just a bit of a grounding of what we'll be covering for today is, of course, we'll have a welcome and overview. Today joining us will be our Public Policy Associate, Helen Griffiths, our Senior Policy Counsel, Rebecca Wallace, and our very special guest, Amber Johnson, who's here to talk about her father as part of this campaign. Again, we'll tell you a bit about the redemption campaign, the issues of mass incarceration as to why we're running this campaign, followed by clemency, a call to action, and some Q&A. So hopefully today what you'll take away from this is understanding why we must decarcerate our Colorado prisons, clemency powers of the executive branch, and some outreach goals, which is urging Governor Polis to make a systemic response to the issue of mass incarceration. But first, what I would like to do is a little bit of a grounding exercise. I want to ask you, how many people do you believe are incarcerated in the United States? So if you go to menti.com and use the code 7873882, you should be able to put in a response. It'll just take like a quick minute or two. Hopefully it pops up. Okay, I have about 2 responses, and I'll pop it up on the screen here shortly. Let's see. Do we have any other responses? So I have 1 million, 2.3 million. Okay. Well, let me share with you. I'm going to stop sharing from there. And share what we have. So we know that there are about 2 million people in the United States that are currently incarcerated. And as of November 2020, Colorado's responsible for incarcerating 16,365 people in our state prisons, with another 12,600 on parole. So while this number may not seem significant on its face, it's also really important to note that just about 40 years ago in the 1980s, this number sat a little bit above 2,600. And with us in the state incarcerating about 635 per 100,000 people, Colorado is now the highest has a higher incarceration rate than any other country in the world. Even recent findings by law students Kristen Nilsson and Gene Siegel show that the state of Colorado incarcerates people at 4 to 8 times per the capita rate than other countries such as Canada, England, and Germany. So with this number over 16,000 in prisons across our state, this is what we want to talk to you about today, is about these 16,000 people, why we have so many people incarcerated in Colorado, and how did we get there? So of course, at the ACLU, we work with many community partners to address and mitigate the ills of mass incarceration. But of course, we're not the only ones who are concerned with this pressing issue. So we're happy and proud to work with NFL players of the Denver Broncos to join us to call for the safe release of people in prison, and have an ad to share with you today. Oh, why is it not working? Sorry, I think sharing my music created a bit of a problem. I'm going to share another screen. Here we go. Sorry about that. It's a bit of a technical difficulty. It is not doing what I want it to do. And that's really upsetting. Oh. Let's go to a different screen. Here we go.
Today, a Black person has a 1 in 3 chance of ending up in prison. For us, that would be like losing 19 members of our football team. That's a major loss for us, just as it is for our communities.
We have the most imprisoned people in the world, and we're supposed to be the free state. We are a nation of the people or a nation of the prison. We cannot be both.
Governor Polis, you have the clemency power to save lives and to define what redemption looks like in our state.
Governor, we ask you to do more.
Thank you. Sorry about the technical difficulties on that end. So with that, I want to hand it now over to, again, our public policy associate, Helen Griffiths, who's going to talk to us a bit about the redemption campaign.
Great, thank you so much, Jess. So on the slide, you will see the goal of the redemption campaign, which is to safely release thousands of people from Colorado prisons. And for some background, we've been working on bringing people home from jails and prisons for a long time, and so have so many inspiring organizations. This work picked up a new sense of urgency during the COVID-19 pandemic. As you've probably seen, there are thousands of cases in Colorado prisons, and 25 people have died. This is because there's limited hygiene, no room for social distancing, and too many people in prison have underlying health conditions or are older. But we want this work to outlast COVID, and the urgent reason to release people from prison isn't just in response to this public health crisis, but because of the decades of racist policies and the legacy of mass incarceration that has ensured there are thousands of people incarcerated in prison despite posing no public safety risk. So the reason we called this the Redemption Campaign is because we need to move away from the history of mass incarceration in this state. Right now, there are over 20,000 children with a parent in prison. This is not the kind of state we want to be. And we hope the Redemption Campaign charts a course to a better future, one where redemption, rehabilitation, and healing is possible, one where we know people are more than the worst thing that they have ever done, that human change is possible, and that everyone deserves a second chance. So how do we do this? How do we move from mass incarceration to this new and brighter future? Well, there's a lot of ways, but one of the most immediate and effective responses is by urging Governor Polis to use his clemency powers to release people from prison. So clemency powers are a power that the governor has to commute sentences and release people from prison. And my colleague Rebecca will explain more about what that looks like in Colorado. But right now, it's used sparingly and in a case-by-case basis. For example, Governor Polis has only released 4 people in the past year, but governors in other states have released thousands of people as the only necessary response to systemic injustice. And this is what we're asking the governor to do. It makes sense that this power is in a governor's hand, because in the past, it was governors who signed these broken policies into law. They tore families apart and decimated communities. And now the governor can use that same power, that same signature to reunite families and heal communities. So that's it. That's the goal of the Redemption Campaign, to chart a better future for Colorado. And in the chat, you'll see our website, aclu-co/redemption, where you can learn more about the Redemption Campaign. It just launched last week with a partnership with the Denver Broncos, and we have more exciting things to come, like a postcard campaign where we'll ask you and your friends to write postcards to Governor Polis urging him to safely release people. So if you go to the website and scroll to the very bottom right under the videos, you'll see where you can sign up to join the campaign and get exclusive updates on the campaign and help join. You'll also get some of your questions answered. For example, can we safely release thousands of people? The quick answer is yes. Did you know that the fastest growing population in Colorado's prisons are people over 50? Just this weekend, I was in Sterling, where I watched Anthony Martinez, who's 84 years old, be released from prison. While it was heartwarming to watch him hug his niece, Kelly, for the first time in over 30 years, it's heartbreaking that we kept a grandfather in prison for that long. And is this the right response? No. We know people age out of prison. And the truth is that over 8,000 people are incarcerated right now for nonviolent offenses. But we need to bring home people who are convicted of violent offenses as well. And that's because even though we as a state have a higher incarceration rate than any other country in the world, we are not safer. Mass incarceration has hurt so many people, and it has done nothing to help us. And so that's why we're asking for you to join the campaign and urge Governor Polis to release people, to fight COVID, to undo the harms of mass incarceration, to champion racial justice, to build the power of redemption, to reunite families, heal communities, and save billions of taxpayer dollars. We know that there is a brighter Colorado ahead, and we need your help. So please go to the website, learn more about the campaign, write to the governor, and help us bring more of our neighbors safely home. And now I'll hand it over to Jess, who will be talking about the history of mass incarceration in our state and why we need the Redemption Campaign. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Helen. So yes, certainly like we have this campaign, but I think it's really important, again, to ask ourselves, how did we get here? So we look at the landscape before mass incarceration. We know that the US didn't always incarcerate so many people in prisons, but we've seen since the 1970s that our incarceration population in the country has increased about 700%. And what has led to this explosive growth of the prison population wasn't any necessarily a change in crime rates or public safety, but rather a change in the rhetoric that politicians were using or have been using to talk about people who are in cages. So until the mid 1970s, rehabilitation was considered to be a part of incarceration. People who were in prison and jails were offered a chance to develop occupational skills and to work on issues such as substance abuse or aggression. But again, gradually, rehabilitation no longer became the goal of incarceration and instead began to be replaced by rhetoric that was more on tough on crime and punishment. So again, punishment being the main function in prisons and jails, and seeing laws and policies change to reflect this new norm. Of course, the contributions to mass incarceration kind of go, without saying. Certainly, conservative forces that were led during the Nixon administration called for the condemnation of all unimproved drug use and really introduced the phrase war on drugs into our American lexicon. But even though he did declare drug abuse as being this public enemy number one, we do see that much of the funding that was under the Nixon administration went towards drug treatment versus law enforcement. However, we see the rhetoric really shift and speed up under the Reagan administration by making more associations of drug use with attacking American values. And it really becomes this political issue where politicians across the aisle are pushed to take more of a tough on crime stance in order to keep their constituents. So what we begin to see as a result is militarization of police forces with increased surveillance and enhanced weaponry, and legislation really expanding policing powers and creating harsher sentencing laws. And let's talk about those harsher sentencing laws. We see that there was an increase of these laws along with the war on drugs as we swung towards this lock them up and throw away the key approach for punishment, and again, away from rehabilitation. So some of the first really harsh sentencing laws started with the Rockefeller drug laws in New York that really instituted these mandatory minimum sentences of like 15 years for small amounts of heroin or morphine or opium. We would see more states follow, and pretty much by 1994, all states would enact some kind of mandatory minimum sentencing. So the impact of these sentencings, of course, are devastating. More people are sentenced to prison. They stay in prison for much longer than under previous sentencing laws. So even though the data shows that people age out of crime, 1 in 9 people in prison are now serving a life sentence, and nearly a third of them are sentenced to life without parole. If we look at Colorado specifically, what we also see as a consequence of mandatory minimums is that the older demographic is growing steadily amongst the incarcerated population in Colorado. We have offenders who are over 50 years of age and one of the fastest growing prison populations in our state. Again, this is despite research that shows that recidivism plummets with age and that older incarcerated people are not a public safety risk. I think it's also really important for us to note that mandatory minimums also took away power from the judges to consider mitigating factors when posing sentences, such as community ties or family responsibilities, and really kind of shifting that power to prosecutors who are, again, more likely to determine the sentences of folks compared to judges. And certainly we have mentioned in previous webinars, like our DA 101, like when that happens is that the pressure is now put on defendants to accept plea bargains in order for a reduced sentence so as to avoid the risk of going to trial. And of course, if you have a defendant that decides to exercise his or her right to go to trial and they lose, then judges really kind of have little choice but to impose those minimum sentences. Of course, we have three-strike laws. This is where we have mandatory minimums that are applied to people with extensive criminal histories or considered habitual offenders, but it's really adding extra, penalties to those with repeat offenses, such as mandatory life sentences without parole. And so while certainly these three-strike sentences were usually applied to convictions of violent crimes, we also see in a number of cases where three-strike laws were applied to relatively minor crimes, such as petty theft. And of course, we would be remiss if we did not address the intersectionality of mass incarceration that it has on communities of color and the systemic racism that is very apparent in our criminal legal system that has led to these disparities. So if we look on a national scale, Black, Latinx, and Indigenous people are dramatically overrepresented in prisons, even though Black and Latinx people make up approximately about 32% of the US population. They make up 56% of all incarcerated people, and this was from data back in 2015. That's astonishing. Over half of the prison population are communities of color. Black men are 6 times as likely to be incarcerated than white men, and Latinx are 2.7 times more likely. For Black men who are in their 30s, about 1 in every 12 is in prison or jail on any given day. If we focus on Colorado, we see that even though Black people account for about 4.6% of our state's population, they comprise of 18% of our prison population. We see that these disparities are even more striking when we talk about life sentences. I want to note that 246 of the 778 individuals serving life without parole are Black. That's about 32% of our life sentences in this state. And of course, the issue of racism and how we see sentencing didn't just come out of nowhere. But this is really a long history of over-criminalizing behavior in our society and attaching those behaviors on the basis of race and or immigration status. We even see that the war on drugs was racialized well before the Reagan or Nixon administration. So for example, we see the first anti-opium legislation in our country during the 1870s also coincide with the increase of Chinese immigration for railroad labor. That goes the same thing with anti-cocaine legislation aimed at Black people during the early 1900s and the criminalization of marijuana between the 1910s and the 1930s that were aimed at Mexican immigrants. Even down to arrest and sentencing, people of color experience disproportionate rates. We see in a national survey by the ACLU that even though Blacks and whites use marijuana at the similar rates, Black people were 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested for marijuana possession. We see historically that even federal possession and sentencing of crack cocaine to powder cocaine, where an ounce of crack cocaine holds the same sentencing level as 100 ounces of powder cocaine. And because the majority of those convicted of crack cocaine violations were African American, again, this really prompted the racial disparities in sentencing in the prison demographics. But of course, today we look, millions of people are incarcerated in US prisons, and folks are struggling with mental illness, substance abuse, and poverty, and yet pose no public safety risk, but they're languishing in cages and really unable to build their lives. And the criminal system leaves very little room for rehabilitation, where we know that humans are capable of changing, and it really denies people of second chances. We see that 79% of people in prison suffer from either a drug addiction or a mental illness. And so instead of uplifting our neighbors, what we're seeing is that we lock them up in prison and we throw away the key. However, it's good to note that we are seeing a tide in the changing attitudes of our society about what we see as punishment and justice, moving away from this proclivity to punish and really kind of tackle these social issues head on. So investing in housing, jobs, education, physical and mental health care, drug treatment, and knowing that this helps that when we address these social issues, crime rates invariably go down. There's also strong support in statistics that people do support decarcerating our jails and prisons. So there's growing bipartisan support that we know that mass incarceration is ineffective, it's harmful, and it's costly. So if we look at the Bully Pulpit Interactive, they did a survey and found that 84% of those support releasing people who were sentenced under a statute that was later changed, but if they were sentenced today, they would not be in prison or serve a shorter sentence. And I think that's really important to note. You know, sometimes when we are doing a lot of legislative fixes about our system, we're always looking towards the future. Okay, we'll do better going forward. But what about the people that we are leaving behind? What about the people who have been serving time for so long? It's really time that we also begin to include them in the conversation. And again, we see that there's public support for that. 77% support releasing people who have served drug sentences that have been longer than 20 years. I think it's also really important to note and bring up the impact that COVID-19 has had on our prison population. So as of today, in our Colorado prisons, there have been 25 deaths, 493 active cases, and just about 8,000 total cases since they started testing in prisons. We know again that, you know, these correctional facilities are really ideal breeding grounds for the spread of COVID because, you know, you have the health challenges of people who are incarcerated, the close confinement of people, the lack of social distancing, poor, you know, healthcare, poor hygiene things, really dangerous overcrowding, and that, you know, sentencing more people to longer sentences has again created this older population that is extremely vulnerable to this virus. It's, you know, really important to note when we're looking at the money side of it, that Coloradans spend about $60,000 per person per year to take care of older incarcerated people, despite the fact that they can remain safely at home with their families. Even though the ACLU and our partners have really worked hard to get the governor to release people due to COVID, there's been just really not a lot of inaction. And so unfortunately, we've kind of lost that battle. But what we really think is important is that this pandemic has certainly brought to the public's consciousness just how many elderly and ill people are in prison. I think it's also important to note too that in those who are surveyed, they say that if there's a review board or a panel to look at people's release, and those people are determined not to pose a threat to public safety, 86% of people say they would support a person's release. And with knowing this, I think it's time that we really do have a conversation about those who are convicted of violent crime that no longer pose a risk to public safety. And, you know, certainly at the ACLU, we certainly care about victims of violent crimes, and we strive to ensure that we are mindful and we're collaborating with community partners for policy change. Certainly we saw that example in terms of working with families when working to repeal the death penalty in this state. On the other hand, we also have to acknowledge that mass incarceration isn't just the result of locking up people with nonviolent drug offenses, and that increasing sentencing lengths for violent crime has also played a role in the expansion of our prison population. And again, as a result, we see this explosive rate of elderly prisoners who have aged out of crime, but yet still locked up in cages. So we see that if If states and federal governments continue at this snail's pace to decarcerate our prisons, it will take us 72 years to cut the US prison population in half. And again, this is because we largely exclude the conversation about releasing folks who have been convicted of violent crimes but no longer pose a risk to our society. So we have to begin to start really debunking these myths about how violent crime comes about. Violence doesn't happen in a vacuum. A person who commits a violent crime does not equate to being a violent person who's incapable of ever being able to exist peacefully in society. And even more broadly, those who are convicted of violent offenses are even less likely to be rearrested in the years after their release. And yet, with all that we know, elected officials often react out of fear because of a single event of violence that further perpetuates this issue of mass incarceration. Certainly, the prime example would be Willie Horton in the political fallout during the 1988 presidential campaign to be tough on crime is really an example of that. But let's be clear, being tough on crime is not rehabilitative. We have all made mistakes that we are not proud of. I would even guess that we have all made mistakes that would be considered illegal in the eyes of the law, but we just didn't get trapped by the system for those mistakes. So if we truly believe in redemption, that people really can change, sorry, dog sneezing, then we must not be afraid to provide safety, compassion, and mercy. Redemption and grace doesn't happen behind cages. It happens when you have supportive family and community, and when you have resources to be successful, such as a home and rehabilitation services. So with that, I want to share with you the words of Daniel Gilroy. He is a formerly incarcerated person who now works with Modus Theater's Just Us project. And he says this: if you drop an oak tree seed in a concrete world, it's still alive in there, and it's vibrant, but it's not growing. It's just dormant. But if you take it from there and drop it in a decent place where there's enough sun, earth, nutrients, you don't even have to plant it. Just put it somewhere that it can possibly grow. The thing will take off on its own. The fact is, all of us in prison are human beings who committed crimes, but that is not our truth. We are not ontologically criminal. That is not our essence. And with that, I want to turn it over to our Senior Policy Counsel, Rebecca Wallace, to talk to us a bit more about the power of clemency in this.
Hello, friends. Thank you so much for being here and joining us for this. I just want to give you a very brief overview on what clemency is and the power that it has. Just the very basic concepts is clemency is a mechanism that the governor has the unique power to grant relief for someone convicted of a criminal offense. And that relief can be relief from any court-ordered sentence. And there are two types of clemency. One of them is commutation, and that's when there's an actual change to the incarcerated sentence. So like someone could have their sentence shortened or reduced to the point that they'd actually be released. And the second form of clemency is a pardon. And that means essentially that your crime is forgiven or erased even. Pardons most often happen after a person's already been released from prison. Commutation occurs when somebody is still in prison. In either of these forms, the governor's power is unilateral. And the idea is to exercise mercy and end imprisonment when it's wrong or no longer necessary. And there's been some questions about the parole board and parole eligibility. Typically, clemency is used for folks who are not parole eligible. So many people serving virtual life sentences or actual life sentences and who are not parole eligible. Sometimes there are folks who have the parole board has failed to act on who seek relief from the governor. And an example would be Anthony Martinez, who Helen was telling us about, an 84-year-old man in a wheelchair who had been convicted on a habitual offender law for 3 robberies 30 years ago, in which nobody was injured, and he was going to die in prison, and he was denied special needs parole. We worked with his niece, Kelly, to advocate for his release, and he was released through clemency. And so I think next we'll talk about sort of why clemency, and I think we'll have the next slide. Yep. So why clemency? So why are we focused on clemency? There are so many different ways and important ways to fight mass incarceration, and we don't pretend that one is more important than the other, but clemency has a unique role. So everyone, our view is everyone must do their part to fight mass incarceration. We, the people, we protest, we demand change, we vote, we run ballot initiatives, legislators pass laws to decriminalize offenses and shorten sentence ranges, and we have police and prosecutors, and they need to wield their discretion more humanely. But those mechanisms are inadequate for the kind of change that is going to undo decades of mass incarceration and centuries of racism in the criminal legal system. So if we want to help folks who are currently incarcerated, almost all legislation is forward-looking. So it's going to handle how we handle people in the future, but not undo what's happening for the people who are currently serving. It also takes years to pass legislation and years often to become effective. But perhaps most importantly, it just isn't backward looking. So the next slide, please. And that's why when we think about where's the hole in terms of who is doing their part, we're looking to Governor Polis to help to do his part to immediately reduce the prison population, specifically by looking at the folks who don't have another out. And he can act immediately without waiting for legislative changes, and he can use sort of the concepts that we all know that led to many of the injustices and unfairness in the system, things like the war on drugs and the myth of the super predator and unequal sentencing of Black people versus white people. These are systemic injustices that we need someone to look at who is currently in prison, that we can safely release, who are the victims of these systemic injustices. And it really is only Governor Polis who can do that unless someone is otherwise parole eligible. So just to give you a sense of where Governor Polis sits compared to other states, and I think the pandemic is a really important moment because I think many governors reflected on their clemency power differently and realized that they could take action in a systemic way to address the pandemic. And what we saw is some other governors took very significant action. We know that Washington governor, for instance, commuted the sentence actually of over 1,100 people to secure their release on a mass basis. And Governor Polis, after meeting with the Broncos and promising to do more, released only 4, which is 1 more than last year. And we think the reason for that is that there's no political will and there's no political pressure. He has ignored this issue because he does not see a political gain by him taking risks on behalf of people who are incarcerated. And he does not see it as a mainstream issue that regular Coloradans care about. And we think that if he did see it as a mainstream issue that regular Coloradans cared about, that he would want to engage on this, and thus the redemption campaign. I'll just leave this up here. I'm not going to go through it, but I'll let you know that we have, and I know there's a lot of questions about who can be safely released. Our campaign seeks to facilitate a program that will allow for consideration of groups in blocks individuals in blocks that the specific nature of their conviction and incarceration raises concern. This is, for instance, people who wouldn't be incarcerated if convicted under current law. Survivors of domestic abuse when there's a nexus between the abuse and the offense. People who are incarcerated just for technical or parole violations. We have a whole list that was put together by the experts that are the founding partners of this campaign, of the kinds of categories that we want Governor Polis to consider. Now, we don't expect him to release everyone in those categories. The next step is to do a safety analysis. And I know a lot of folks have questions about the safety analysis. I don't have time to go through it here, but I can tell you that there are a variety of different mechanisms that can be utilized to assess somebody's safety for public release, and that there are many people who have gone through the Clemency Board and have been unanimously recommended for release, who are sitting on the governor's desk right now, that the entire Clemency Board agrees would be safe for release. And yet the governor sits on those petitions. And so this is not a matter of not being able to identify many folks who could be safely released. So I just want to pass this on now to the next the video that we're going to share with you that gives you an example of one of the people who the governor has the power to release. His name is Ronald Johnson, and he's a grandfather who's really turned his life around in prison. And I won't say more about it, but I'll let you know we are so lucky to have Amber Johnson with us as well. His daughter, I apologize, who is going to join us in this conversation and help us better understand how failing to act on his behalf, how the governor failing to act on his behalf, the downstream terrible consequences for the entire community.
Oh, these things are not working. Switch it over. So we're not sure why these are not working anymore. I'm going to reshare my screen.
Your own life, and then all of those around you who love you, whose lives that you would have been in every day had you been home. The impact is really immeasurable. I'm Amber Johnson. My dad's name is Ronald Johnson, 62 years old, and he has been incarcerated for 22 years now in Denver, Colorado. And he has some medical conditions that do make him at high risk for COVID, such as high blood pressure. He's pre-diabetic. He also has asthma. What led to my dad's incarceration is that he was a drug addict, and he, along with a group of friends, would steal so that they could fuel or fund their drug addiction.
While Mr. Johnson has so far served some 22 years in a Colorado cage, his actual sentence was for almost 100 years. So almost a century is what he was sentenced to for crimes that were nonviolent.
It's horrifying to have my dad incarcerated during this pandemic. The fact that he does not have the ability to really keep himself protected from that type of contact and those types of circumstances is horrible. And to know that folks with pre-existing conditions are at highest risk for this disease makes it that much more disturbing.
My name is Ronald Johnson. This COVID-19, I've never seen anything like it. You don't know what's going to happen. It's just changed everything for me. And the new norm is, it's difficult to even speak with.
To have a family member who is serving an unfair and harsh sentence that really does not fit the offense is traumatizing. And I live with the reality that I could potentially see my dad die in prison. I live with that every day.
I do be afraid, not just for me, but someone that's in the same situation as I'm in. I've come so far. Everyone wants to see me make it home. That's my fear, is not being able to make it home.
I was extremely angry at my dad when he caught this case. Then I saw him evolve as a person while he was incarcerated and really changed his life. He got sober and really just started living his life with the highest of virtues and values, and just still shocking, even 22 years later, that is even possible for someone to be sentenced to that type of time for a nonviolent crime. He is not a threat or a danger to our community. And in fact, he's really needed in our community.
Ron Johnson has done the work of building a community within the cage. He doesn't have to be in a cage to do that. What he did, he could have done in a loving, warm substance abuse treatment on the outside, where he had fresh air and could see his grandbabies. COVID is really showing us that the systems we've relied upon have not worked. We wouldn't be in a position now where we have the same level of the public health crisis, because we wouldn't have people in cages for poverty, for sleeping on park benches, for being addicted to substances. COVID-19 certainly would have hit anyway, but we'd be looking at a very different public health crisis if we hadn't focused on these carceral entities of cops, courts, and cages. There are more folks in cages now pre-trial than there were totally in cages 40 years ago for everything. None of these circumstances are ones that warrant exposing someone, the other people who are in prison, but also the corrections officers and nurses, to a disease that kills fast and kills in terrible ways in the name of punishment. Decades later, it's offensive to our sensibilities, and it should be offensive to our governor.
I've just been a parent and a grandfather on a real mission, and that's to get back to my kids. I like to spend as much time with my grandkids as possible.
For months now, Governor Polis has implored us as Coloradans to do your part to keep yourselves and your neighbors safe. And yet, when it comes to folks who are most vulnerable, Governor Polis is not doing his part. He needs to exercise his clemency power.
His responsibility is to protect the health of Colorado, including those who are incarcerated. There are so many inmates who are not a threat to society, who are unnecessarily incarcerated. To have him come home, it would mean so much to myself, my children, his family, his loved ones, and his friends, because he's got a lot to offer the community. He has a lot to offer his family. He's a very smart man. He's a very compassionate and loving man. It would mean that we could kind of, in a way, not right the wrong that he received an unfair sentence, but at least give the story a happy ending.
And I would like an opportunity to spend the rest of my time with my family. I would really like a second chance at life.
And now we have Amber Johnson here. Thank you again for joining us and for sharing your father's story.
Yeah. Thank you for helping, for having me here, and for helping to advocate for my father. My dad is now 63 years old, and he's now served 23 years of a 96-year sentence for a nonviolent offense. And it never gets any easier to say that. it's just devastating to the entire family. His parents saw him suffer, incarcerated for a number of years before they passed away, and now he has, a new generation. Those are his grandchildren there. He has now a fifth grandchild that's not in the picture. Family members who have to see him in a cage for an offense that it's just outrageous that he could even receive a 96-year sentence for. He was a drug addict, and he used to steal, and his charges are theft, forgery, and fraud, which are things that I think a number of people who are addicted do in order to support their habits. But nowadays, addiction is seen as a healthcare issue, medical issue. It's not seen as a criminal issue like it was in 1998 when he was arrested. And so our family has just been fighting for a number of years to help him. Number one, because his sentence is just so cruel. I think he has to be one of the strongest people that I know to be incarcerated and to have the strength to get sober, to receive job training, to work, to help others, to tutor others, to be involved with church ministry and training programs and prepare himself for a release that he hasn't even been told that he'll get anytime soon. For most of the sentence, he really didn't even have the hope of a release. So I'm really proud of him, and he makes it easy to fight for him. Honestly, had he not changed, he still deserves to have us fight as hard as we are.
Oh, we have you breaking up just a little bit, Amber.
Sorry, I'm not sure what I can do differently, but I do thank you all for your help and your support. Unfortunately, my dad has now tested positive with COVID as of January 7th, which was knocked me off my feet to hear him call me with that news. But fortunately, he seems to be holding up very well through it. He's pretty healthy, and his symptoms are kind of that of a mild cold. But COVID is a disease that you don't know how your body will respond to it when you get it, and if you will be severely incapacitated, if you would die, or if you'll be asymptomatic. And fortunately for him, he has not had many symptoms. So, but I was so afraid the day that he called me with that news. So just thank you all for your advocacy, for fighting. My family has made it through 23 years, and I'm hoping that we are on the home stretch and that Governor Polis will finally start hearing our voices of all the people who are fighting to get folks like my dad home, because there are so many like him who are needlessly incarcerated. And it's time for them to come home. And especially now that COVID is impacting the prison and jail community the way that it is.
Thank you so much for that, Amber, and definitely will be continuing to hold, your father up and so many others who are in prison battling COVID right now, and just continue to keep thinking of his strength for sure.
Thank you.
So with that, I'm thinking of turning it back now over to Helen, who can now really kind of explain, as part of the redemption campaign, our call to action, what we are asking for you here to do today.
Thank you, Jessica. So I know we're nearing the end of the hour, and there were so many great questions. So what I urge you to do is, please, instead of the link in that email, I'm just sending it right here in the chat. Please take a minute to email Governor Polis. You've heard from people like Amber. There are so many families like that across Colorado who live in fear every day for their loved ones' safety right now. And as you can see in the chat, I sent the link to other family members and people who were lifting up, who clearly pose no public safety risk and yet are still in prison. So please take a moment right now to go to aclu-co.org/Clemency to contact Governor Polis. And if this is something that you're interested in learning more about, if you want to stay engaged, please make sure to go to aclu-co.org redemption, which is our website. And there, if you go to the very bottom, you can sign up and join the campaign. And we'll send resources, and this is really helpful to see what kind of questions you have that hopefully we can help answer. And to help join in the future, we have a postcard campaign coming up, and we're working with over a dozen amazing organizations across the state, so there'll be a lot of things to come. So please use the last few minutes that we have to go to email the governor and to sign up to the campaign. And if you're someone who wants to do even more, who wants to push a little bit further, you can also use our social media toolkit, and you can contact Governor Polis. You can tag him on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter, urging him to release people from prison. And feel free to share something you learned in the webinar today, and help uplift the redemption campaign and the need to safely release people from prison. So thank you so much for all the questions, all the engagement, and there'll be more webinars like this, so make sure to just stay engaged in the campaign. Thank you.
Yes, and we definitely want to, note that we want to continue to have a conversation with you about decarcerating and releasing people from a variety of correctional facilities, not just prisons, but jails and juvenile detention facilities, and talk about the impact that this has on our immigration detention facilities, and also, what that means for folks looking for reproductive care in these facilities. So certainly, please stay tuned. We are going to continue with a webinar series later in February and March to have these conversations as we go through the legislative session, and what you can do to help us to make this change. So definitely with that, open it up for questions. Again, thank you so much for joining us. And Delaney, do we have any questions in our Q&A?
It looks like more of the questions were in the chat. There's a question: how can a viewer provide constructive feedback? I'll go ahead and drop my email in the chat, and you could just send that to me. Actually, the two questions look to be more of comments. So is there anything in the Q&A?
I just want to quickly answer.
They want, yeah, do you have ones you want to answer in the chat there, Helen?
Just a few really quickly.
Okay.
So first of all, I think a few people who are joining us have family members incarcerated and are hoping to learn more about how they can uplift their loved one's story. So feel free to email me. I can put my email in the chat and share a little bit about your loved one, as we're hoping to show people that there's many people in Colorado's prisons who could be safely released and have loving families to come back to. And then another question that we saw a lot was just about how we know who can be safely released. And for that, in the top section of our website, you'll see our requests of Governor Polis with who specifically we're asking as a category of release. And you'll see also a section addressing that. How can we safely release people from prison? And I think that'll be a helpful resource, because I think, as Jess talked about, from a legacy of mass incarceration in this country, we've really associated prisons as a holding place for really dangerous people, instead of what it often is, as a holding place for people who are older and, it's been 20 years since the crime they committed, or people who are struggling with serious substance abuse or mental health issues, and prison isn't the best solution to that. So this is a first step in trying to rethink prisons and what role they actually serve in society, and the categories of people for which we're seeking release are people we know aren't a public safety risk. And we're working with lots of other organizations to help figure out how to do this work safely and to help bring families home. So I just wanted to address those 2 questions I saw on the chat.
Yeah, and Helen, if you can go ahead and drop your email in the chat. So there's some people who are asking, like you said, about their family members becoming a redemption story. So it'd be great if you put that in the chat for us. And other, let me see. Okay. And we are just focusing on Colorado, but this is a ACLU campaign across the state. So there are other affiliates who are working on other states. Okay. Looking at the chat too. And so we will have updated information, and this webinar itself, the recording, will be available on our website. We will also be sending information out to everyone who attended today, and even the people who signed up and couldn't make it. So we hope you will join us in the coming weeks when we do more of these webinars. And any last words before we shut it down? Helen, are you able to answer everything before we? I don't want to cut off the webinar until you are able to do that.
I think I see that we answered them, but if there's any more questions, feel free to email me and I'll try to see if we can answer them. And yes, lots of people also asked about reentry and how, because, you know, releasing people from prison is just a first step. And I see Hassan Latif in the chat with Second Chance Center. And this work has been going on for decades from so many organizations. So we're partnering with many organizations with a lot of expertise to make sure that we're not just bringing people home and leaving them. We're helping people contribute to their families and communities.
All right.
Helen, before we go, would you mind just letting folks know who our founding partners are in this campaign?
Yes, of course. Sorry for muting myself. So the founding organizations are the Second Chance Center, the Colorado Criminal Justice Reform Coalition, the Office of the Colorado State Public Defender, the Powell Project, and the ACLU of Colorado. But since then, we've been really lucky to have a dozen other organizations join, including Interfaith Alliance, NAACP, Black Lives Matter 5280, so many amazing organizations. And we'll be updating our website with all the organizations that have joined onto this campaign and how you can learn more about them and how you can support them in their work. So make sure to just keep going to our website for more updates. Thanks.
Okay, well, great. Like Helen said, check out the website and we will be sending all this information out via email. You can also email me. My email address is dmaynes@aclu-co.org. All right, so we're going to wrap it up for today. And thanks again for everyone who joined us.